Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the CUHK 50th Anniversary Distinguished Lecture by Professor Herbert Marsh. My name is Nathan Wong, a PGDE student from the Faculty of Education. Today, we are greatly honored to have invited Professor Herbert Marsh, Professor of the Department of Education of University of Oxford, to deliver a lecture on the university campus. First of all, may I have the honor to invite Professor Hao Kit-tai, Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, to deliver a welcoming address and introduce our speaker. Professor Hao, please.
Welcome to the Chinese University 50th Anniversary Distinguished Lecture Series. I was told that if I repeat anything that you should have already known, I'll get a low rating. So I won't be telling you anything about the speaker, which is here, anything about the talk, which is here, and I won't, and nor should I introduce our honored guest, Mrs. Cherry Zhe, the Permanent Secretary of Education. I should not introduce her. And perhaps it's worthwhile for me to mention about three things. Professor Herbert Marsh is the author of one of the most popular student evaluation of teaching instrument in the world. And his instrument is the most researched instrument in the whole world. He has published a lot of reviews on student evaluation of teaching. The most recent one should have appeared in the Handbook of Higher Education. If you have interest, you can look into that. And before I disappear, in 5 seconds, actually, he has done a meta-analysis. You know, it's an analysis of all the analysis. He has done an analysis on the relation between research, productivity of research activities, and quality of teaching. The result is there's no relation. Thank you. Let's welcome Professor Marsh.
Okay. So just a brief introduction. Some of you already know me because I actually come back here fairly frequently. I think I first came here about 20 years ago, and every couple of years I come back and do some interesting sorts of things. So I have actually a long history of talking to people here, and it's wonderful to be back again. And certainly it's a great honor to be a keynote speaker for the 50th anniversary. Thank you very much for having me. Here's just a little bit about who I am. I publish a lot. My research is highly cited. I'm pretty good at winning grants. I'm on the Australian and British Academies of Social Sciences, and I have joint appointments at 3 different universities, and at UWS, where in Australia in particular, I've had lots of different titles. We did some qualitative research on my research track record, and this was a pictorial representation of my publications. But I guess to the right are sort of a listing of some of major interests that are both substantive and methodological. I guess my niche area, to the extent that I have one, is substantive methodological synergy. A phrase that I coined in an article that I published with KT in the Contemporary Journal of Educational Psychology. In that article, we argued that some of the best methodological research is based upon the development of creative methodological solutions to difficult problems that actually arise. So the methodological contributions that I've made are oftentimes trying to solve very difficult problems, and they come up with very interesting, I come up with interesting problems, and then as a consequence of that, some of the really strong methodological people from around the world like to work with me because I have more interesting problems than they do, particularly if they're not actually working with real data. But then the new methodologies provide important new approaches to current and substantive issues. And so certainly some of the issues that have not been resolved in the past can be at least better looked at with some of the new methodology that is available. And I guess the problem with the substantive methodological synergy is it's getting rarer and rarer because the divide between the substantive and the methodological is getting bigger than ever. And so there's lots of methodologists that don't have any substantive background at all. They're just working with numbers or maybe simulated data or maybe helping substantive researchers, but even then, maybe not too much of that. And then there's lots of substantive researchers who have just kind of given up trying to keep pace with all the methodological. And so I'm trying to fill that niche where I'm a bridge between those two. So today I'm going to talk about student evaluations of teaching, and certainly this is one of my major substantive areas. Perhaps you'll see the methodological synergy in some of the things that I talk about, but this presentation is probably more substantive rather than methodological. So here's an outline of the topics that I'm going to present. It's a fairly straightforward, psychometrics and sorts of issues, biases, of particular focus on how to improve teaching effectiveness, a little bit on what KT mentioned, the nexus between teaching and research, also the issue of benchmarking universities. There's several different purposes, traditional purposes for student evaluations. Certainly diagnostic feedback to teachers, personnel decisions, student course selection, and a basis for research on teaching effectiveness. The first purpose, at least in lip service, is nearly universal, and the additional three may be a little bit more controversial. So let me begin by summarizing where I want to end up, what I want to convince you with my presentation. So my research, more than 50 articles, and there's literally thousands of published articles in this area that I've reviewed, these lead me to the conclusions that student evaluations are multidimensional, they're reliable and stable, they're primarily as a function of the teacher who teaches the class rather than the course that's being taught. They're valid in relation to a variety of indicators of effective teaching. They're relatively unaffected by a variety of hypothesized biases, and they're seen to be useful by students for use in course selection, by administrators for personnel decisions, and by teachers for feedback to improve their teaching. So the issue of effective teaching is a multidimensional construct, so it's not surprising that student evaluations of teaching are also multidimensional. For example, it's quite reasonable or quite possible that a teacher may be high in organization and low in enthusiasm, and this distinction, this separation, should be appropriately reflected in the student evaluations of teaching. The information from sets depends on the information and the content of the items. Poorly worded or inappropriate items will not provide useful information. Furthermore, if an instrument contains an ill-defined hodgepodge of different items and the sets are summarized by just taking an average of these items, then there's no basis for knowing what it is that's actually being measured. The SEEK instrument contains 9 multi-item scales that I have listed here, 2 overall rating items, an overall teacher and overall course rating. There's also some 3 open-ended questions, and then there's also provision to provide additional questions from an item bank or unique items that are provided by the department or the individual teacher. For personnel decisions, there's still a controversy as to whether multidimensional profile of student evaluations are more or less useful than a single summary score. For feedback to teachers, use in student course selection, and use in research on teaching, however, there appears to be general agreement that a profile of distinct components of student evaluations based on an appropriately constructed multidimensional instrument are more useful than a single summary score. The factor analysis support for my SEEK instrument is very strong. More than 30 published factor analysis of SEEK responses have identified the factors that SEEK is designed to measure. The studies using the applicability paradigm support the SEEK factor structure for responses by students in different countries and very different settings. Teachers were also asked to evaluate their own teaching effectiveness on the same SEEK instrument as completed by their students, and factor analysis of instructor self-evaluations identified the same SEEK factors as factor analysis of the students. So how well does the SEEK factor structure generalize across different disciplines? For a sample of 25,000 classes, this is a large archive, I conducted factor analysis for the total sample and for each of 21 subsamples or unique groups of teachers who varied in terms of academic discipline, psychology, engineering, etc., and level, undergraduate and graduate level courses. The factor analysis for the total sample and each of the 21 subsamples all identified the same 9 seek factors. The seek factor structure is very robust. So the debate about which components of teaching effectiveness can and should be measured has not been resolved. However, there's a consistency in those that are identified in the most carefully designed instruments such as SEEK. Homemade surveys constructed by lecturers or by committees are rarely evaluated in relation to rigorous psychometric considerations and considered accordingly. They fail to provide a comprehensive evaluation of the set dimensions. This undermines their usefulness, particularly in terms of diagnostic feedback. It's also important to note, as I said earlier, that SEEK Forms provides for additional items selected from an item bank or items written by the instructor. In this way, it provides a compromise between uniformity and flexibility. Let me move on to the issue of reliability and stability. The reliability of sets is most appropriately determined from studies of inter-rater agreement, that is, the generalizability of ratings over students in the same class, the extent to which students in the same class agree with each other. The reliability of class average responses depends largely on the number of students rating a class. Given a sufficient number of students, set reliability compares favorably with the best objective tests. However, even for small classes, good reliability can be obtained by averaging results from several classes. So if you look at this diagram or this slide, you can see that it takes 15 or 20 students in a class to get reliable ratings. For most cases, classes are larger than that. Keep that figure in mind because we'll come back to that figure later on. Well, here's a very important aspect of it, of student evaluations. What's the relative importance of the teacher versus the course? Can you use student evaluations to evaluate the course rather than the teacher? How highly correlated are sets in 2 different courses taught by the same teacher, the same course taught by different teachers on 2 different occasions? For the overall teacher ratings, the same teacher teaching the same course on 2 occasions, the correlation is 0.72. This is a combination of teacher and course effect. The same teacher teaching 2 different courses, the correlation is 0.61. This is a measure of pure teacher effect, a little bit lower, but not much. The same course taught by 2 different instructors, correlation minus 0.05, essentially 0. This is the course effect. Similar results were found for the overall course rating. So even when we asked students to evaluate the course, really what they were evaluating was the teacher. In summary, sets primarily reflect the teacher who is doing the teaching, not the course that's being taught. This has very important implications for their use. They are good for evaluating teachers, but apparently not very good for evaluating courses. Now, let's look at the long-term stability of SEEK responses. Do former students view effective teaching differently after they've graduated and had a chance to use the materials? Cross-sectional studies show good agreement between the retrospective ratings of former students and those of current students. In a unique opportunity, I did a true longitudinal study when the same students evaluated classes at the end of the course and again several years later, at least 1 year after graduation. End-of-term ratings in 100 courses correlated 0.83 with the subsequent ratings. This correlation approaches the reliability of the sets. The mean ratings were also similar on both occasions. Sets by the same student at the end of a course and several years after graduation agree very well. Now here's another look at the long-term stability. Cross-sectional studies at different levels of education suggest, unfortunately, that teaching effectiveness declines with experience and age. Teachers don't get better with more experience. This isn't true just at higher education, it's true at all levels. There may be a little bit of improvement during the first couple of years, but then from then on, there's no further improvement and usually a decline. In a true longitudinal study, I considered 195 teachers evaluated continuously over 13 years. So each teacher had ratings for at least one class during all 13 years, an average of over 30 classes per teacher over this time. So here's a graph of the results. Each of the 195 gray lines represents ratings by one teacher over 13 years. The red line is the grand mean over the 195 classes. The green line represents ratings of one teacher over 13 years that were consistently one standard deviation below the mean. The blue line represents ratings of one teacher over 13 years that were consistently a standard deviation above the line. For most teachers, there was no systematic increase or decrease in the ratings over the 13 years. Now, the bad news is that these people were getting the student evaluation, so they didn't get any better. The good news maybe is that most other studies show that they declined, so at least they stayed consistent over the 13 years. But this is remarkably consistent. The ratings are very strong. The ratings, so mostly if you don't have systematic intervention, teachers don't get better, they don't get worse. Extended this to look at profiles. So this is the different SEEK factors. High in organization, low in enthusiasm, for example. So thus far, we've just looked at individual SEEK scales. Using the same longitudinal data, we tested whether each teacher has a unique profile of SEEK scales. Profile level refers to the tendency for all scores to be high or low. Profile shape refers to the tendency for systematic patterns particular to a specific teacher. As I've said, high on organization, low on enthusiasm, and so forth. The results show that each teacher has a characteristic profile that is consistent across different courses and over time, and distinct from other profiles of other teachers. So the level is stable over time, but so is the profile. Let me now move on to the issue of validity. Effective teaching is a hypothetical construct for which there's no single indicator. Hence, the validity of sets and other indicators of effective teaching must be demonstrated through a construct validity approach. Sets are positively related to many criteria of teaching effectiveness, including, as we've already talked about, the ratings of former students, student achievement on multi-section validity studies, which I'll talk about in detail, teacher self-evaluations of their own teaching effectiveness, and the observations of trained observers on specific processes such as teacher clarity. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of this validity research is to look at our student evaluations valid in relation to what students actually learn. This is a very difficult topic, particularly in higher education, because you can't compare scores on the final exam in psychology with scores on a final exam in engineering. They're completely different tests. So what we developed was what is referred to as the multi-section validity paradigm. In this paradigm, there were many courses, many sections of the same course, large introductory courses with many parallel sections. Each section is taught by a separate teacher, but has the same course outline, textbooks, objectives, and final exam. Students are randomly assigned to the different sections, or at least don't know particularly who the teacher is that they're enrolling with. The final exam reflects the common objectives for all the different sections. Students evaluate teaching effectiveness on a well-standardized instrument before the course grade is known, and then the section average sets are related to section average exam performance, controlling for any pretest differences. The research questions then are set valid in relation to objective measures of student learning when other counter explanations are not viable. Now, this is such an important area that there's been lots of studies that have been done of this, using this paradigm, and some meta-analysis of the research. Cohen conducted a classic meta-analysis of multi-section validity studies. Student achievement was consistently correlated with sets. For a subset of 41 well-designed studies, correlations between achievement and sets were more substantial, many of the correlations greater than 0.5. This demonstrates that students' evaluations of teaching are substantially related to student learning and constitutes a very important support for their construct validity. We also have emphasized in my research program teacher self-evaluations of their own teaching effectiveness. In 2 studies, teachers evaluated their own teaching using the SEEK instrument and were evaluated by their students. Separate factor analysis of the teacher and student responses identified the same SEEK factors. Student-teacher agreement on all the dimensions was significant, supporting convergent validity, and student-teacher agreement was specific to each dimension, supporting divergent validity. Mean differences between student and teacher responses were generally small. Students' ratings weren't systematically higher or lower. So these results support the validity of the student evaluations in relation to faculty-teacher self-evaluations. Now let me talk just a little bit about peer ratings based on classroom visitation. There was a classic study done by John Sintra from Educational Testing Service. He had 3 peers sit in on each of 2 occasions. What was interesting was this was a brand new university, one where the teachers didn't already know each other, and so they didn't know people's reputation based upon what they had heard from students. In this research, he found peer ratings had from one peer to the next were almost uncorrelated. So there was almost no agreement between the different peers, and not surprisingly, the peer ratings weren't very related to the student evaluations either. Murray, in his review of this research, argued that classroom visitations were less sensitive, reliable, and valid, more threatening and disruptive, and more affected by non-instructional factors such as research productivity. He found in his research that ratings by observers tended to be more reliable, but he first of all gave them extensive training looking at specific aspects, but he also said that it took 20 or more observer reports to get minimal ratings. Now, if you remember earlier on, I said that it takes 15 to 20 students to get reliable student ratings. And this is a student who's been exposed to the teacher for a whole course, probably 20, 30, 40, 50 hours of instruction. So it's hardly surprising that one person, a peer, going in and sitting on one class, that their ratings are not reliable. So don't use peer ratings to evaluate teaching instruction unless you're going to have 20 peers go in at different times during the course to sit there. Now, peers can be useful. Peers are probably quite useful in terms of evaluating how up-to-date the reading list is and the content and things like that, but they're not particularly good for evaluating teaching effectiveness. So, in support of the validity of student evaluations, I list some of the things that I looked at. Here I return to the initial summary of the validity of sets. So, they're valid in relation to a variety of criteria of effective teaching. Now, let me move on to a rather controversial topic. Teaching and research are typically seen as the most important products of university academics. Blackburn caricatured 2 opposing opinions about the direction of the teaching-research relationship. So he said that a professor can't be a first-rate teacher if not actively engaged in scholarship. Based upon this, the correlation should be positive. The opposite end says unsatisfactory classroom performance comes from neglecting teaching responsibilities for the sake of publications. This would suggest a negative relationship. In collaboration with John Hattie, we did a meta-analysis that is still the most extensive review of the relationship between teaching effectiveness and research productivity. Based on 58 studies and almost 500 correlations, we reported that the mean correlation between measures of teaching effectiveness, mostly based on student evaluations, and research productivity was almost exactly 0. This lack of correlation was consistent across different departments, different types of universities, different indicators of research, and different components of teaching effectiveness. So it was a very robust finding. I came up with a model to try to explain, or maybe explain away, this 0 correlation. I argue that the ability to be an effective teacher and an effective researcher are positively correlated, that time spent on research and teaching are negatively correlated and may be influenced by reward structure and motivation that systematically favors one or the other. Effectiveness in both teaching and research is a function of ability and time and allocation and motivation. Thus, the positive relationship between abilities in the two areas and the negative correlation in time spent in the two areas will result in little or no correlation in measures of effectiveness in the two areas. When we actually tried to test this with our meta-analysis data, what we came up with is that time on research, all this makes sense, time on research is positively related to research productivity, was not related to teaching effectiveness, and negatively related to time on teaching. So there was some negative relationship. Time on teaching, however, is not related to teaching effectiveness, and this is incredibly damning. So the more time people spend preparing for teaching doesn't change their teaching effectiveness. Now, I think what's happening here is that if you don't know how to be an effective teacher, then spending more time on it isn't going to do much good. Time spent on teaching was negatively related to research productivity and negatively related to time on teaching. We did another much more extensive study at one university based on multiple indicators of teaching and research and moderators. However, they largely supported our earlier results. There was an antagonism between teaching and research in terms of time, motivation, and goals. These results were consistent across different departments. Even faculty self-evaluations of teaching effectiveness and research productivity were almost unrelated. And any of you who do survey kind of work, there's always a halo effect. So if you ask people if they're good at any two things, there's some people that say they're kind of good at everything and some people that say they're kind of bad at everything. So even for the self-ratings, there was almost a zero correlation. Also in this research, we constructed what we called teaching research nexus scales, the belief that teaching contributes to research or research contributes to teaching. These scales were moderately reliable and seemed to have held up, but even people that were high on these scales had a zero correlation between teaching and research. We argued that universities need to set as a mission goal the improvement of the nexus between teaching and research. And here's some suggested strategies that we suggested might help them. Indeed, the existence of this synergy is a prerequisite rationale for having a research university. If there is not this synergy, then why have a research university? It's probably more effective or more economic to do teaching in teaching-only institutions where there's no research. It's probably more efficient to do research in research institutes where there's no teaching. So the existence of a research university depends upon this synergy, and yet there's not a lot of evidence for it. And so one of our arguments is that universities should make as a mission to encourage and support this research synergy, this teaching research synergy. Let me move on to the issue of potential biases. There's many unsubstantiated myths about potential biases, the sets, they flourish. The research is typically atheoretical, methodologically flawed, and not based on a well-articulated definition of bias. One allegation, for example, is that in order to get good evaluations, teachers only need to reduce the workload and demand on students. Now, support for a bias hypothesis must be supported by a construct validity approach. You can't prove causation with correlation, and this gets very tricky in this area. If the relations are consistent across multiple indicators of teaching effectiveness, student evaluations, teacher self-evaluations, test scores, then the effect may be a valid influence on teaching effectiveness rather than a bias. If the relations of a particular background variable vary systematically and logically with different set factors and match a priori predictions, then the results, again, may support the construct validity of sets rather than a bias. So let me start off with looking at the class size effect. So is this a bias to student evaluations? Class size is most negatively related to group interaction and individual rapport, but these are the set factors that you would logically think that large class size would be negatively related to. In contrast, class size is positively related to set factors like organization. So I may be willing to wing it if I'm going into a little seminar with 10 of my students, but if I'm going into a lecture hall with 500 people, I'm going to be pretty organized. This same pattern is found for class size and teacher self-evaluations of their own teaching effectiveness, the same pattern of results. Also, there's an interesting nonlinear components. Sets decline and then increase for very large classes. For the very largest class, sets are as positive as they are for the very small classes. So class size apparently has a valid effect on some aspects of effective teaching that are accurately reflected in the sets and in student evaluations of teaching as well. So here's a graph of the class size relation in the overall rating. It shows a negative relation. For very large classes, the ratings are as high or higher than for small classes. Now, I can't tell you what that relationship is based on, but we did do some detective work. First of all, we found that most teachers are comfortable teaching small classes and get less comfortable teaching larger classes. And as the class size gets larger and larger, eventually they have to give up and go get help to get special techniques that are more appropriate to large classes. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is that the causal relationship may be opposite. Teachers who are wonderful teachers have a reputation for being really great teachers, and they tend to have very large classes because they're very good teachers. We also had a situation in one university I was working in. They had a very famous physics department, but they didn't have very many physics majors. And they were going to lose academics. They were going to lose faculty positions if they didn't get more majors. And we found that in that class, in the physics department, the large introductory classes were getting the highest ratings, and so we went and talked to them and asked them what that was. And they said that because they wanted to encourage majors in physics, they got all their best teachers to teach the introductory classes, so hopefully those people would be. So trying to unpack some of these correlations are pretty complicated. Here's a more contentious one. The workload difficulty. So what's the relationship between workload difficulty and student evaluation? Well, I argue that it's not a bias, mostly because the observed relationship is in the wrong direction. Easy classes get worse ratings, not better. A similar pattern was found between workload difficulty and teacher self-evaluations of their own teaching effectiveness. There's a small nonlinear component to this relationship whereby student evaluations get better as workload increases up to an optimal level, flatten out, and then decline for very high, perhaps excessive levels of workload. These results are consistent with theory and have important practical implications for effective teaching. Subsequent research suggested that useful workload is more positively related to evaluations, whereas non-useful or busy work is not. So the workload difficulty effect is in the opposite direction to that predicted by a biased interpretation. Then it's not reasonable to call it a bias. So here's a graph of the nonlinear relationship. For low and average ratings, the increasing workload leads to higher ratings, not lower ratings. It's only for the very high levels of workload, these are like 2 standard deviations above the mean, that increasing workload leads to lower ratings. So not that you'll be able to read these, but this is an overview of a whole variety of potential biases. And my general conclusion in the review is that there's little support for the contention that student evaluations are biased by characteristics that are unrelated to teaching effectiveness. Let me move on to maybe the most important aspect, using student evaluations to improve teaching effectiveness. There have been many set feedback studies in which teachers are randomly assigned to experimental feedback and control no feedback groups. The sets are collected, ratings are returned to feedback instructor, augmented perhaps by personal consultation, and groups are compared on end-of-term ratings and perhaps other variables. In a meta-analysis of these studies, instructors who received midterm feedback were subsequently rated about 1/3 of a standard deviation higher than control teachers. Studies that augmented feedback with consultation produced substantially larger differences, but other methodological variables had relatively little effect. So 2 early feedback studies that I did using multiple sections of the same course. The first study, we just gave feedback from an abbreviated survey, and they were simply returned to the teachers. The impact of the feedback was positive, but very modest, so we were quite disappointed. In the second study, we met with teachers in the feedback group to discuss the student evaluations and strategies for improvement. Students in the feedback group rated teaching effectiveness more favorably at the end of the term. They also performed better on a final examination performance that was common to all the different sections, the feedback and the control. And they also experienced more favorable affective outcomes, feelings of course mastery, and plans to pursue and apply the subject. Study 2 was very important because it demonstrated that augmented feedback improves student learning and subject affect, as well as improving subsequent evaluations based on student ratings. Now, this feedback aspect was so important that I developed a prototype SEEK feedback consultation intervention. Teachers were randomly assigned to groups, so it was a true random controlled trial. At time 1, the middle of semester 1, time 2, the end of semester 1, and time 3, the end of semester 2, all teachers evaluated themselves and rated the importance of each of the SEEK factors and were evaluated by their students on the SEEK factor. At time 2, feedback teachers selected target SEEK factors that were important to the teachers based on their ratings of what was important, had low ratings, they needed improvement, and were seen by teachers at, quote, appropriate areas to target improvement efforts. A critical aspect of this research was what we call the teaching idea packets. So for each of the for each of the SEEK factors, each idea booklet, there was a separate booklet for each factor. Each packet contained up to 40 strategies, and these were based upon qualitative interviews with outstanding teachers from a variety of different universities. So we asked them what were some of the strategies that worked, and then we sorted them into these different categories. With the consultant, the teacher selected a few strategies for each target SEEK factor and how they would be implemented. The consultant summarized the SEEK factors and improvement strategies targeted by the teacher, left them the idea booklet, and followed up in writing with a little memo and by phone. The consultant was very low-key. I started doing some of the consultancies, and I was no good at it. I wasn't effective at it because people looked at me and said, this is the new professor at this university, and he might be on my selection committee or something later on. And so instead I had my very meek and mild my graduate student doing the interventions, and he wasn't scary to anybody, and he was much more effective than I was. And he started off by saying, I'm not an expert in your content area, but I can talk about what the student evaluations mean, and we can talk about some of the strategies, but you're the content expert. So it was leaving the instructor room to be pleased with what their expertise was and not trying to come in and tell them what to do. Because teachers only targeted one or a few of the scales, the interpretations of the overall ratings are most straightforward. The effects were significant for all 4 rating items, effect sizes between 0.4 and 0.5. That's a very large effect for a very simple intervention. This was an hour one-to-one and another half-hour follow-up. Relative to changing teaching effectiveness by that amount, that's amazingly cost-effective. Now, let's see how the intervention worked with the target scales, those the teacher chose for the intervention compared to the non-target scales. So at pretest ratings, the ratings of the target scales were all much lower than the non-target scales for both groups. This was part of the reason they were selected, because they were initially low. The control group post-test ratings on target scales were still much lower than their non-target scales. For the intervention group, post-test ratings were all much higher. Target scales were now similar to non-target scales. So the interventions improved target scales much more than non-target scales. So the target scales went from being the lowest to being equal highest. Consistent with the rationale of the study, the ratings of the target scales improved substantially relative to the non-target areas for the experimental group, but not for the control group. This is also a very important source of validity for the ratings, because if you want to test the validity of something, try and change it. And the fact that we were able to change the scale that the people chose to work on was strong support for the multidimensional perspective. The most important results of the investigation were to provide varying degrees of support for a priori predictions that the SEEK feedback and feedback consultation provided an effective means of improving university teaching. The effects were stronger for initially less effective teachers. In support of the multidimensional SEEK perspective, improvement was largest for the targeted SEEK factors. It was very important that for teachers to specifically target particular scales. The teaching packets were important. Even if teachers are motivated to improve their teaching, they apparently do not know how to do so. They need concrete strategies to facilitate improvement efforts. However, few universities implement teaching improvement programs as part of the collection of student evaluations, even though there's clear evidence that there were. What happens with the sets without the consultation intervention? Well, we looked at that earlier. The longitudinal studies show that the ratings are remarkably stable over 13 years. Now, hopefully, we're looking at the possibility of replicating and extending this study here at this university. And KT and I are, Professor Howe and I are talking about the possibility of pursuing that possibility. Let me return to my original set of conclusions. Student evaluations based on the teacher as the unit of analysis are multidimensional, reliable and stable, valid, relatively unbiased, and seem to be useful by all the major stakeholders. Let me now turn to another topic that is related to this, but actually quite separate. It may not be quite as useful here because it's different here, but let me talk about it. Several countries, including Australia and United Kingdom, use ratings of graduating students to evaluate the overall educational experience. The critical issue here is that the unit of analysis is the whole university or departments within a university. So I've done large-scale studies of this at across Australian universities and across UK universities. So this first study was done in cooperation with the Higher Education Academy, which is really quite remarkable because I told them ahead of time that I was going to identify problems. And not only did they give me access to the data, but they even funded the research that I was doing, saying that if there's problems, they'd rather know about it and have it come from a friendly source rather than the media. Okay, so in this study, we looked at 2 years' worth of data. All graduating UK students were asked by the government to complete the National Student Survey. This is very interesting. So it wasn't done by universities, it was imposed by the national government, and it was sent out directly from the government, not through the universities. The response rate was very good for survey research, about 65%. The database used in my research was very large, 150,000 students from each of 140 universities in each of 2 years. However, the critical question is, are the ratings able to differentiate between universities and departments within university? If it's a benchmarking exercise, then they have to be able to discriminate. That's the main purpose of what they were collected for. Here we have what I call a caterpillar plot for differences between universities based upon the National Student Survey global ratings. Each triangle is a mean satisfaction rating for one university. The vertical line that goes above and below the mean is an error bar, the range of probable error. The longer the bars, the more error. The solid blue line is the mean rating across all universities. For example, this one extreme university has a mean 4/10 of a standard deviation below the average across all universities. The error bar, the range of probable error, varies from -0.2 to -0.7. So this university is significantly below the mean of all other universities. This caterpillar plot is useful comparing a few universities are below average, that is the whole error bar, fall below the mean for all universities. A few universities are above the mean. The error bar is completely above the mean, but most universities do not differ significantly from average. The error bar overlaps with the mean. So they don't do a very good job of differentiating between universities. Okay, so how about departments within universities? There were 19 discipline categories that resulted in 1,565 departments disciplined within university groups. Differences between groups were larger than differences between universities. However, the error bars were much larger. So that only at the extreme, where there were a few extreme departments that differed significantly from the mean, and a few at each end above and below the mean. So for the most part, the departments the ratings weren't able to distinguish between different departments, either departments within a university or the same department across different universities, which was obviously an important aspect of what they were supposed to do. Now, eventually, I talked the Australian government into giving me access to their data. That one took a longer time, so this publication was only done in the last year or so. The Australian government and universities cooperate and collect standardized data of many types that are used to compare universities, a benchmarking exercise. The Australian Course Experience Questionnaire is used to compare undergraduate teaching in different Australian universities to benchmark teaching effectiveness. The Australian CEQ is the oldest of the University Department experience type instruments and one basis for the National Student Survey. In his review, Richardson indicated that it was the only one that had been carefully developed prior to the UK National Student Survey. You're now familiar with caterpillar plots, so I'll just briefly present the results on the CEQ. Even more clearly than the National Student Survey results, the results show that there are almost no departments or universities that differ from the grand mean. Following the development of the CEQ, the PREQ, Postgraduate Research Evaluation Questionnaire, was designed to compare universities and disciplines within universities on the quality of research supervision of PhD. Logically, the individual supervisor should be the appropriate unit of analysis, but for reasons of anonymity, supervisors were not identified on the PREQ. And this is because students, they'll only have, probably you'll only have one PhD student evaluating a year, never more than a couple. And so if you get bad ratings, you know who it was. And that PhD student is dependent upon you for at least the next 10 years for letters of reference and so forth. So the anonymity is probably much more important than classroom ratings. In my research data, PhD students who graduated from 32 universities, study 1, and 35 universities in study 2. In neither study were there any significant differences between any two universities. In summary, the reliability of the PREQ responses for purpose of differentiating between universities did not differ significantly from zero. The PREQ responses were unreliable, so they must be invalid, and they were shown to be uncorrelated with research productivity, number of PhD student scholarships, and attrition rates. So we concluded that PREQ responses were unlikely to be useful for any of the purposes which they were designed, including benchmarking and improving universities. Now, logically, CEQ, National Student Survey, and PREQ, it doesn't make any sense. If you want to compare different universities, it makes no sense to ask a student who's only attended one university. Because even if that university was quite good or not so good, that student wouldn't have a frame of reference that included other universities. So it's hardly surprising that the results don't accomplish what they want to accomplish. So let me finish up with a few comments. For purposes of comparison, consider caterpillar plot for the set responses. This was based on the longitudinal study that I presented earlier, 195 teachers over 13 years, an average of 31 classes per teachers. The ratings of individual teachers are highly differentiated relative to the CEQ type ratings. There's large differences between teachers relative to probable error. Many teachers are consistently below average over 13 years, some differences greater than a whole standard deviation. Many teachers are consistently above average, some greater than a whole standard deviation. So student evaluations at the classroom level are able to differentiate between teachers. Student evaluations of teaching on SEEK-type instruments are good at reflecting teacher effectiveness of individual teachers. Importantly, when coupled with appropriate enhancement interventions, they lead to improved teaching effectiveness. They may also be useful for personnel decision and student course choice. However, these ratings are not particularly good at benchmarking whole universities or departments or even classes independent of the teacher who teaches them. The CEQ, National Student Survey, and PREQ type responses provide limited evidence about small differences in student satisfaction with educational experience at the university or department level, but only at the extremes. These studies focused almost exclusively on reliability type issues. Unlike the SET research, there's almost no rigorous evaluation or validity research asking whether the limited differentiation is meaningfully related to other indicators of educational experience or are useful in leading to improvement. So, in summary, there's no basis for using CEQ type ratings or approaches instead of student evaluations of individual teachers or vice versa. They have different purposes. However, there's limited rigorous evidence of CEQ type responses that they're reliable, valid, or useful for any purposes. The substantial SET literature in support of their reliability, validity, and usefulness should not be used to justify CEQ type ratings. CEQ ratings should only be used with extreme caution, and certainly they should be qualified by estimates of probable error. Now, let me also end up with just a couple more points. One of my pet peeves, well, I got a couple of them in this area. One is that it's almost immoral for universities to collect student evaluations and not have a systematic improvement exercise. It's no good to tell teachers they're no good unless you're going to systematically work with them to try to improve their teaching effectiveness. One of my other pet peeves is that if you have a student evaluation program, it should be mandatory to have a research component as part of it. Why is the research component important? Well, to begin with, at the start of the program, it's important to validate the instrument and the data collection processes. It's no good using an instrument that's not working, so that needs to be validated, and that needs to be done by research. It's important to evaluate and improve the process to enhance its usefulness, particularly in the kinds of research that I was doing to improve teaching effectiveness, and to provide internal and external credibility for the program. So if some of your research is being published in internationally important peer-reviewed journals, that not only gives the university credibility outside of the university, but it also gives the program credibility within the university. It's also important to maintain strong people and program vibrancy. If you have good people in your student evaluation program and all you're having them do is just process results and feedback the results without any research component, then you're going to lose those good people because they're going to want to go on and do more interesting things. So in summary, an ongoing research program should be an important component of the teaching, learning, and research unit that coordinates the student evaluations. For this reason, I'm currently working with colleagues at this university to develop perhaps a research program that I may or may not have any further involvement with, but I hope will be an ongoing research program here. Let me just finish with one other aspect. There's a real interesting dilemma here. This research, there's thousands of studies based upon university students evaluating university teaching. There's almost no research based on high school students or even primary students evaluating teaching effectiveness at the school level. However, it's my belief that many of the findings from universities will generalize to schools. It's very difficult to get into the schools. The schools mostly aren't willing to even do research in this area, let alone have ongoing programs. Now, I'm actually currently involved in a very large-scale pilot study in the UK with high school teachers, and their initial results are very promising. So maybe next time I come back and talk to you, I can tell you about those results. I'm also exploring the possibility of doing this in Australia, and who knows, maybe Hong Kong as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marsh, for sharing your words of wisdom. Please take a seat on the stage. Professor Marsh has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. Professor Howe will conduct the question and answer session. If you would like to raise any question, please raise your hand, and our helpers will pass you a mic.
Thank you, Professor Marsh, for the very interesting talk. And as you know, a lot of these sets are now being done online. So have your research looked at that?
Well, I've talked to a number of people about this, and what I found in most places is that the response rate, if you do it near the end of the class, is 80, 90%, almost always at least 70%. And if you do it online, the response rate drops to 20 or 25%, and it's unlikely that those 25% are representative of the class as a whole. But I know that in 2 instances, I've been told that if the giving back of the marks or the grades is made contingent upon doing the student evaluations, that the response rate goes up a lot. And but at least in one case, the quality of the ratings went down. So the psychometric properties of the ratings went down. The other instance that was here in Hong Kong, as you mentioned, I don't know yet because it's still too early to tell. But certainly there's advantages to doing that. We talked here, I was talking to other people here about that. We suggested, well, everybody has a mobile phone or an iPad, so maybe they could fill them out electronically in class. But I don't think that would work because class time is precious, and I'm pretty sure that it would take more time to get people to fill it out electronically than it would with a paper, because there would always be 10% of the students who couldn't find out how to get the right place and so on and so forth. But I'm very interested in the research, and it may be I'm just showing my age, still using paper, pencil, scan forms. Eventually it's going to have to happen, and I guess the issue is whether we can come up with a strategy that maintains the good response rate and the quality of the ratings in spite of using the electronic process. Certainly it's more effective and a lot cheaper for the university to do. I'm working at King Saud University in Riyadh, and they have a process where the students don't get their grades until they fill in the questionnaires, and they get almost 100% response rate. But they had 2 questions out of 30 items. They had 2 questions. One said mark bubble number 2, another one said mark bubble number 4. And when I went back to look at this data, 25% of the people filling it out got those wrong. And the factor structure that should have been there didn't hold up. It was pretty shaky, and so I suspect that they had some resentment or just carelessness. I'm not sure whether it was just carelessness, whether it was passive resistance, or maybe even active resistance.
So that's why CUHK is still using paper form. Any other questions?
Thank you very much, Professor Marsh. I think this is very informative. One of the things that caught my eye is actually your compensatory model, where you have research and teaching, both ways. So I was wondering if you have any example of maybe incentives whereby teaching and research can actually be tilted based on the policy of the institution. Thank you.
Empirical research, no. We came up with a variety of strategies that we felt, if implemented, would reinforce those, but those are our best wishes rather than something that we've actually tested out. They're pretty hard to test out. It's pretty hard to actually test those out empirically, and but it is a very serious issue for me because, as I said, I think that it's a requirement of a research university to try and support that synergy. And in fact, I think universities are going in the opposite direction. I think that universities around the world are having more teaching-only positions and junior positions where people are basically there to teach big introductory courses and to have research-only positions. So I don't hold great promise for that, but it's still one of my pet peeves that I talk about whenever I talk about this research in this area.
Professor Marsh, thank you very much for your very stimulating talk. You mentioned that one study based on Mary, and he talked about peer review and said that the result concluded that the peer review is not effective in assessing teachers' performance. I just wonder whether there are any other studies that also...
No, there's lots of studies. I just highlighted. There was one study that was particularly unique because it was based upon a brand new university where people didn't know each other. There's lots of studies, and the results are fairly consistent. That there's, if you ask teachers to evaluate, if you ask peers to evaluate other teachers without visiting their classes, then there's reasonable agreement. But when we look at that, what happens is that everybody knows who's a good teacher based upon what the students say. But if you actually have peers visiting the classes, then they don't agree very well. And Murray did quite a bit of research on that area and showed that you had to give them training and you had to have lots of them. Now, if you ask them very focused questions and you show them videos and say, this is what you're looking at, and you have lots of people looking at it in sitting in on different classes, and you aggregate their data, then you get reasonable peer evaluations. But no university is willing to do that on an ongoing basis, I would guess, and certainly peers wouldn't be. There are things that peers can do. I mean, there are good things that peers can do in terms of evaluating the syllabus and things like that. But having peers sit in and evaluate the teaching effectiveness based upon sitting in on classes really doesn't work very well.
Thank you, Professor Marsh. If I would use one adjective to describe your talk, it's counterintuitive. It challenges a lot of the assumptions that we have about teacher recruitment, teaching and learning, and continuous professional development. What I said may be a little bit messy because I try to juxtapose various points that you've made. You said teachers doing the teaching, not the course that is being taught. And you said that actually we should sort of measure the teacher rather than the course. But in another way, when you talk about using the SATs to benchmark universities, I noticed that the benchmark is done at the university and the department level rather than the faculty, the individual teacher level. Then to what extent sort of do the two correlate? And if not, then sort of what's the purpose of benchmarking university or department? Or should we actually, when we sort of draw a league table, measure the quality of the university, it should be an aggregate of individual teachers? Because this actually flies in the face of what the UK has done and what Hong Kong has copied the UK practice. Because in UK and Hong Kong, we actually do quality assurance by looking at the process rather than what the Australian has done by looking at the standard, the outcome. And here, it may go one step further when you say sort of you measure the teacher, the sets, and it shows that over a period of 13 years is relatively stable. And so if this stability is indeed true, does it mean that continuous professional development is not of much use? And then when you say peer review is not that effective, but you say that actually is review plus consultant being more effective in remedying what we think is less effective teaching, then on what basis should the consultant help out when it's not based on peer? Is it looking at the questionnaire outcome of what the students are saying about the teacher, then the consultant will help the professor out without actually observing how the class is conducted. And lastly, when you say that the teacher's own evaluation...
I don't have that good a memory.
Because... Yeah, because this is actually crucial to the whole piece. I deliberately leave it at the very end. Is when you say that the teacher's evaluation of their own teaching is quite consistent with the student's own evaluation. This flies in the face of our understanding of teaching practice, because we think the teacher would try to teach a lesson to the best of his ability. No teacher would deliberately prepare a suboptimal class. So I'm just thinking that then on what basis would a teacher think that my teaching just now is ineffective? So it's really, that's why I said it's somewhat counterintuitive.
Well, if I've been provocative, then I'm glad. And there's certainly, and all the things that I've presented are well based on research. Let me talk about one of the early points that you made. If you go into any academic unit, a department or a university, there's good teachers and there's bad teachers, and there's a range of them. And so if you take an average across good teachers and bad teachers, you're going to come up with something average. And that's not going to be very good as feedback for the individual teachers in particular, but probably not even for the individual department. Student evaluations of classroom teaching are good at evaluating teachers, but if you aggregate them together to get a department average, they don't work. And if you ask and it's even more problematic when you ask students to evaluate a whole academic career, because then they're going to think back, well, this was good and that was bad, and so there's some good and what's some bad, and how are they going to make those evaluations? And so it's not that the benchmarking per se is bad. Obviously benchmarking is a good practice, but you need to have good criteria, and student ratings aren't a good basis for doing that. In terms of the research that I know best, where I know the ratings tend to go down with age and experience, is at the university level. And, but I've also read, not my research, but other research that shows that this tends to happen at different levels of education. I think at the university level, what's happening is that university teachers mostly aren't trained to be teachers. And they remember what they had as undergraduates, and that becomes more and more of a distant memory as they grow older and older. And unless they are actively involved in in-service courses and things like that, then they're not going to be keeping up on their teaching effectiveness. And teachers know whether they're good or not, and it's not that they go in and try and do something suboptimal, but just like you know whether you're good at tennis or not, or whatever. And it's not that you're going to not try at tennis, but you just know your limitations, and you know what you're good and you're bad at. And teachers are just like anybody else. They like to do and pursue what they're good at and tend to ignore what they're not very good at. And so bad teachers mostly don't get better unless there's a systematic intervention that takes place. And what I find amazing is that the consultancy that we're talking about, the person that goes in, the main purpose of that consultancy is two things. One is there's first face-to-face interaction with somebody, and it means that the teacher is going to have to look at the evaluations and do some self-reflection on what they mean. And then this meek, mild consultant is going to come in, not with any great expertise or not as a peer. Certainly this person wasn't a peer. And he came in with this strategy book. And so the teacher would sit down with a strategy book and say, oh, well, that one doesn't work, or I think I already do that one. And he'll say, well, maybe that one would work. And then the consultants would say, well, how would you go about implementing that? And then the teacher would talk. And they'd pick 2 or 3 strategies out of the 30 or 40 that were available in each book, and that they would go and implement those. And that made a difference. I suspect that even people that give lip service to the student evaluations, they probably just sit on the desk, and I'll get to them sometimes, and sometimes they're difficult to understand, particularly if you don't have, if you don't take some time and you don't have at least somewhat of a quantitative orientation, then the results may be difficult to interpret, and they may, people may not take the time to do that. I'm not sure. Those are at least some of the things that you asked.
Well, at the very beginning, you told us that the student self-evaluation is multidimensional. But in most of your research findings that you reported, I think they are mostly a composite score or an overall rating, right?
No.
So then when you talk about teachers, when you plot all the teachers' ratings, is it an overall rating or which dimension you're talking about?
Well, when I talked about biases, class size was negatively related to enthusiasm, or negatively related to individual rapport and group interaction, and positively related to organization. Very different. For the feedback intervention, teachers chose a particular area that they were weak in, they focused on that, and that one got improved much more than the other areas. So the multidimensionality, now probably I couldn't give it full in the time that I had, but the multidimensional perspective is the fundamental basis of what I'm looking at.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. That teaching effectiveness is multidimensional, but first, I think in research, people usually lump them together, get an overall score, which I think is against the multidimensionality. But second, in practice, when we talk about personnel decisions, how can we handle the multidimensional scale, use the multidimensional scale in a personnel decision?
What I argue is that should be up to the individual teacher. The individual teacher should make a teaching portfolio, and they should argue what their philosophy of teaching is, and they should demonstrate support for that in relation to the multidimensional profile of ratings that they have. So if they're strong and if they're good in things that are critical to their philosophy of teaching, then that's good. And if they're weak in areas that they argue isn't important to their philosophy. Now, whether somebody else agrees with that or not is another issue, but the process of making that argument and developing that argument is a very important one, and it'll probably improve teaching effectiveness in of itself. But yes, for personnel decisions, there is an argument that some sort of global rating should be used rather than the profile. I prefer the use of profiles, but you can go either way. For every other purpose, certainly for diagnostic feedback, the global rating doesn't make any sense.
Can we have 2 to 3 more questions? And then we'll end.
Thanks, Professor Marsh. One thing, I don't know what is the recurring questions regarding to the workload. Very often, I mean, teachers are enthused and they want the students to do well. They want the students to learn. And somehow what it implies to that the teachers might give more than the students expected. And I don't know, I heard many occasions the teachers was actually punished because they give the students too much homework or assignment. So what's your view? Thank you.
Well, my results that I presented here based on 50,000 classes were quite clear. For most of the range of workload difficulty, the relationship is positive. The ratings were higher for courses that were more difficult. And it wasn't until the extremely high workloads, 2 standard deviations above the mean, that the ratings started to drop. So there's no evidence for that. And there are lots of myths about student evaluations. People don't necessarily like to be evaluated, and university academics are better trained at being critical of research and evaluation sometimes than they are at being good teachers. So there's lots of criticisms of student evaluations that really just don't stand up in relation to empirical support, and that's one of them.
Hello, Professor Marsh. I would like to hear your views on the question of response rate. And as you said, I mean, with online evaluations, we are seeing a significant drop in the response rate. But the question is, what is an acceptable response rate? And if there's any model, mathematical model, statistical model to justify the response rate?
Well, there's no magic bullet. More is better. 100% is great, and if you don't have 100%, then you worry a little bit about it. But 75 and 80% is what we usually get when we do it at the end of the class. And there's a huge difference between that and the 25% if you get. Now, you told me that you were getting 80% with online, but that was with the requirement that they have. That the grades they don't get the grades until then. I guess and if you can show that the quality of the ratings is maintained, like the factor structure that it's supposed to measure, if they based on paper and pencil and online, if you can show me that that is maintained, then I'll be quite excited. And because I think that obviously is an effective way of going, but I'm skeptical.
I'm sorry, can I follow up a little bit? Because in your presentation, you talk about reliability, which you said, with only something like 25 to 50 students, you can get a really high inter-rater reliability. So
it's a little higher. You need a bit more than that. You need 20 to 25. Yeah.
Yeah. So does that mean that with if you have a big class with a 40 or 50 response rate, then you get already more than 50 students?
Yep, and reliability is the beginning point. If you don't have reliability, then you can't do much more. But there's more than just reliability. And one simple way of evaluating your online is to, you've got probably have a year's worth or more of data that was collected by paper and pencil. And within another semester or so, you'll have a year's worth of data that is based upon online. And if you can show me that the inter-rater reliability is maintained, that will be very positive. That would be certainly a good point. So I'm happy to be shown that that's the case. I'm skeptical, but I would celebrate with you if, in fact, you can show that you can do it online as effectively as you can do it. I'm a little worried about the implications of saying you don't get the ratings until you don't get your grades until you do the ratings. That makes me squirm a little bit, but I'm willing to keep an open mind about that.
So in addition to N, number of respondents, you also care about the representativeness of the sample.
Well, he's saying he's got 80%. If you tell the students...
He's not from Xi'an.
I'm sorry, have I got the wrong person? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. When you were talking, okay. All right. In any case, if you can get a high enough response rate, and if you make the grades contingent upon filling out the questionnaire, then you'll get a high response rate. So I'm not exactly comfortable with that, but I'm quite interested in what the research results show in relation to that. I'd like to be shown the results.
Yes. So it's not the total N that you are worried about, it's the representativeness of the, so even for...
Well, it's also the quality of responses. When, in my Saudi Arabia example, when 25% of them didn't get the questions right when they said fill in number 2,
I'm sorry to have second bite at the cherry. Just now, if I understand you correctly, you say that research productivity bears no strong and positive correlation to sort of the quality of the teaching. Mm-hmm. And anecdotal evidence locally seem also to support that. And so I'd like to ask a very practical policy question. Assuming that you're the president of a university, how would you recruit teachers, and how would you evaluate teachers for the purpose of promotion? Should there be two separately ladders? Because very often we now look at publication in Reverie Journal.
Well, I guess I would begin by saying, okay, there's teaching, and there's research, and there's administration, and community activity, so those are the 4 basic criteria. I would add another one. I would add teaching research synergy. and I would say, how are you effective? And people should give a portfolio when they when they go for promotion. And I would put as a criteria research teaching synergy. How do you put those together, either in your teaching or your research or your activity? And academics, if there's something tied to it, can be very creative, and I'll bet you'll get lots of good ideas if you actually require them to do that.
Or join the CUHK research team, right? On teaching evaluation.
Thank you, Professor Marsh and Professor Hao. To show our appreciation, may I invite Professor Alvin Leung, Dean of Education of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, to present a souvenir to Professor Marsh. May I also invite Professor Poon Wai Yin, Director of the Center for Learning Enhancement and Research, and Professor Hao to come forward and take a group photo.